In the next series of videos, the focus will turn to the field of psychology. To begin this exploration, two particularly significant books have been chosen, and the first of these is Psychology and Alchemy by Carl Jung. Before entering into the material of the book itself, it is important to outline the central idea upon which Jung's entire psychology rests: the collective unconscious. As its name suggests, the collective unconscious is both unconscious and collective. It is unconscious in the sense that the processes taking place within it occur outside of awareness. Unlike conscious behavior, these processes are not noticed directly and are not subject to deliberate control. They nevertheless influence experience and behavior continuously. It is collective because it does not belong to a single individual. Rather, it is universal. All human beings participate in it, just as all participate in the shared conscious world of everyday life. Alongside the world we know and perceive, there exists another world that operates beyond direct perception. Jung held that this unconscious realm is populated by archetypes, or archetypal figures, like the mother, the father, the child, the fool, the trickster, the wise old man, archetypal events, such as childhood or death, archetypal motifs, such as creation and destruction. All of these are archetypes. They are meaningful patterns that exist within the unconscious and exert influence on human life in countless forms. They are always present, appearing differently depending on circumstances, life stages, and situations. Every person was once a child, and the child archetype embodies the patterns connected to childlike behavior. This archetype does not disappear with adulthood. Archetypes are not temporary states. They persist throughout life. The meanings associated with childhood continue to shape the psyche at every moment, influencing emotions, reactions, and perceptions long after physical childhood has passed. In this way, each archetype carries its own specific meaning, and these meanings unfold repeatedly across different periods of life. Being a child does not mean we are physically the child archetype. We are in a psychic relationship with this universal child archetype throughout the entire life, a meaningful pattern which expresses itself through our psyche in numerous different situations. Every single situation and moment in our lives is filled with countless archetypal images and motifs. Just like in the world we see around us, there are various images, sounds, events, in the same time stuff is happening in this other world we are unaware of. For example, we have a lifelong psychic relationship with the universal mother archetype, and this can be expressed as a mother complex in our everyday life, as our relationship with the archetype forms through our real-life relationship with our mother. And even as we get old and when our parents are gone, our psychic relationship with the mother archetype never ends. So the mother archetype is not our mother, it is the psychic image of the mother that every human being has, and our relationship with our mother shapes this psychic image. And even after our mother is gone while we are still alive, our relationship with the archetype continues to evolve through time. Because the archetype is always there, even after we die, it is in the unconscious, always present and in various different relationships with every single human being in history. To give another example, as a child, we can have a teacher or a mentor, which is connected to our psychic relationship to the wise old man or woman archetype. And throughout our life, the connection with the wise old man or woman is shaped by our experiences, and at the same time, our relationship with the archetype shapes our experiences. While we are a child, for example, experience of having a teacher shapes our relationship with wise old archetype, but then when we become old, and when we take the role of teaching others, this experience of teaching others shapes our connection with wise old man or woman archetype. Therefore, conscious and unconscious are two aspects of the same world and of each single individual. Thus each person, in every stage, every moment of their life, has a unique relationship with this collective realm populated by archetypal images, or shared realm of unconscious. This individual participation is therefore called personal unconscious. Jung described his idea by stating, "My thesis, then, is as follows. In addition to our immediate consciousness, which is of a thoroughly personal nature and which we believe to be the only empirical psyche, even if we tack on the personal unconscious as an appendix, there exists a second psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature which is identical in all individuals. This collective unconscious does not develop individually, but is inherited. It consists of pre-existent forms, the archetypes, which can only become conscious secondarily, and which give definite form to certain psychic contents. In its simplest form, it can be described as shared meaning, something in which all participate, whether consciously or not. Another important concept that needs at least a brief description before we begin is the concept of individuation. In short, individuation is the goal of Jungian analytic process, which, in essence, means to achieve wholeness. Wholeness means to establish the new center of personality by including both conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. This can include a process which Jung called integrating the shadow, which means repressed traits that were suppressed by conscious psyche into the unconscious because of some inability or difficulty of dealing with those traits. Bringing these traits back into consciousness, or integrating the shadow, can be one step towards achieving individuation or wholeness. As Jung states, the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona, or ego, on the one hand, and the suggestive power of primordial images on the other. Therefore, individuation means achieving proper alignment with the self, which consists of both conscious and unconscious elements. It is synonymous with the alignment, the aim, finding the center, or the path, achieving the goal. In alchemical symbolism, it is the magnum opus, or the great work. That was a brief outline of the main theory on which Jung built his entire body of work. Now we can begin with the main topic. There is much more that can be said to properly introduce this theme of the collective unconscious, but as we continue exploring this work, these ideas will become clearer. Jung begins by addressing two kinds of readers. For those already familiar with analytical psychology, he suggests that no special introduction is required. But for readers who are new to the subject and come without prior knowledge, some form of orientation is necessary. The themes of alchemy and the process of individuation may, at first glance, appear to be entirely unrelated, making it difficult to imagine any real connection between them. Jung felt compelled to explain this connection, especially since feedback from his recent lectures at the time suggested confusion among some of his critics. He emphasizes that what he presents regarding the nature of the psyche is grounded primarily in his direct observation of people. He acknowledges that some have dismissed his observations as dealing with unfamiliar or inaccessible experiences. However, he points out a curious tendency. Nearly everyone, regardless of expertise, assumes they already understand psychology, as if the psyche were something self-evident and easily grasped. Yet those with genuine insight into the psyche will agree with Jung that it remains one of the most obscure and enigmatic dimensions of human existence. It is a field where learning never truly ends, and as Jung says here, in his clinical practice, he continually encountered new and unforeseen phenomena. He admits that his experiences do not typically arise from the obvious, surface level of life. Nevertheless, they are entirely accessible to any psychotherapist engaged seriously in this area of work. Jung then turns to the analytical process itself, describing it as a dialectical exchange between the conscious and the unconscious, which tends to unfold in a way that suggests movement toward an unknown goal or resolution, a mystery that has long held his attention. This can affect not just the one undergoing treatment, but the practitioner as well. No one can work with fire or poison without being touched at their most sensitive core. The true healer is never an outside observer, but someone wholly immersed in the reality of the work itself. Jung explains that while the patient may be unconsciously, but persistently, seeking a solution to a problem that may in the end be insoluble, the role of the doctor is to assist in this striving with all the skill and insight available. He recalls the words of an old alchemist, "Ars totum requiret hominum," the art requires the whole person. It is this whole person that both the therapist and the patient are ultimately searching for. Their shared effort is directed toward discovering the hidden and still unrealized totality of the human being, the fuller and future self yet to be revealed. However, Jung warns that the road to this wholeness is far from straightforward. It is a long and winding path, marked by detours, errors, and reversals. It moves not in a straight line, but in serpent-like twists, reminiscent of the caduceus, the ancient symbol that unites opposites. This path is not without fearsome encounters. It leads one into those regions of experience that are often considered inaccessible. But, as Jung points out, what makes them inaccessible is not their remoteness, but the tremendous effort they require. They demand the very thing people instinctively avoid, wholeness itself. While many speak of this ideal easily, in practice it is avoided, and the preference is for a kind of compartmentalized psychology, where different parts of the self are kept separate and unaware of one another. Jung observes that this situation cannot be blamed solely on the unconsciousness or helplessness of the individual. It also stems from the general psychological upbringing of the European mind. This education, he argues, should be the domain of religion, which, unlike rationalistic systems, has the unique ability to address both the outer and inner aspects of a person. One might be tempted to accuse Christianity of having failed to develop further, but Jung is cautious not to place the blame for human failings entirely on religion. He distinguishes between the true, profound understanding of Christianity and the shallow interpretations and serious misreadings that are evident to any observer. He reflects on the principle of imitatio Christi, the call to follow the ideal embodied by Christ and to strive toward becoming like him. In theory, this ought to elevate and transform the inner self. Yet in practice, many followers have reduced the ideal to an external object of worship. This very act of externalizing the ideal, Jung says, prevents it from reaching the depths of the soul, where it might bring about the transformation it symbolizes. The divine mediator remains outside the person, an image to be admired rather than a force that renews the inner being. Thus, a person may go so far as to imitate Christ even to the point of physical stigmata, without ever approaching the true essence of the ideal. Jung insists that true imitation is not a matter of surface mimicry that leaves the individual unchanged, a hollow image of virtue, but a realization of the ideal from within, granted by divine favor and made real in one's personal life. Still, he acknowledges that even a mistaken imitation may involve an extraordinary moral effort. This total surrender to a supreme value, even when misdirected, can carry with it all the strength of a genuine spiritual striving. And through such effort, even if the ultimate goal remains out of reach, a person may be granted a fleeting glimpse of their true wholeness, accompanied by that unmistakable feeling of grace that such moments bring. The false notion of an entirely outward imitation of Christ is deepened by a particularly Western bias that sets the European mindset apart from that of the East. In the Western mode of being, there is a fixation on the 10,000 things, an attachment to multiplicity, to particulars. The Western individual is tied to the ego, bound to external objects, and remains unaware of the underlying root of all existence. By contrast, the Eastern perspective treats the world of particulars, and even the ego, as something akin to a dream. There is an orientation toward a deeper ground of being, a center that draws the individual inward with such force that their relationship to the outer world becomes profoundly relativized, often in ways that seem incomprehensible to the Western mind. In Western thought, the external world dominates perception, which leads to a tendency to fixate the image of the ideal, such as Christ, in a purely external form. This removes its deeper, inner relationship to the soul. A telling example of this outlook can be found in the way certain biblical translators have rendered the phrase referring to the kingdom of God. Instead of interpreting it as something within you, they have chosen to translate it as among you, an alteration that reflects this outer orientation. This is not to discredit the Western attitude or deny its internal coherence. Its adherents are generally convinced of its correctness. However, for anyone seriously attempting to understand the Eastern view, especially those approaching it from a psychological perspective, there is often a lingering discomfort that is hard to shake. Those who feel certain in their judgment are free to hold their conclusions, though in doing so they may be, perhaps unconsciously, placing themselves in the role of judge over the world. Yet it may be wiser to hold onto a kind of sacred doubt, which refrains from violating the untouched mystery of that which lies beyond ordinary understanding. In the Christian tradition, Christ as the ideal figure is said to have taken upon himself the sins of the world. But if that ideal is kept entirely external, then the individual's sins, too, remain outside. As a result, the person becomes even more fragmented, and misunderstanding makes it easy to offload personal responsibility by projecting it onto the figure of Christ, thus avoiding the most serious inner obligations. This runs counter to the true spirit of Christianity. Such superficial formalism was among the very conditions that led to the Reformation, and similar tendencies can still be found within Protestantism today. When both the highest value, represented by Christ, and the deepest negation, sin, are treated as external, the soul is left empty. It has been deprived of both its summit and its depth. In contrast, the Eastern approach, particularly in Indian philosophy, locates both the highest and the lowest within the transcendental subject. This elevates the concept of the Atman, the self, to a position of supreme importance. In the West, however, the self has been so devalued that it appears to have no real worth. This has led to a widespread disregard for the soul. To speak of the soul or psyche as something real is often met with accusations of psychologism. Psychology is treated as if it was something merely incidental, only psychology, with no deeper implications. The very idea that psychological factors might correspond to divine figures is often viewed as diminishing or disrespecting the divine. It even seems like sacrilege to propose that religious experience might be a psychic event, because such experience is presumed to be more than just psychological. In this view, anything psychic is reduced to mere nature, and nature is considered unworthy of the sacred, despite the fact that many of these same critics are quick to trace all religions, apart from their own, to purely psychological origins. There is something revealing in the fact that two theological reviewers, one Catholic, the other Protestant, completely ignored a central demonstration in a work on religion and psychology, the clear evidence for the psychic roots of religious phenomena. In light of this situation, one is compelled to ask, how can it be claimed that something is only psychic, as though the psyche were of no value? Such language reflects an attitude common in the West, where the soul is often treated as if it were worth little. Were there depth or substance in the soul, people would speak of it with reverence. The absence of such reverence suggests that nothing meaningful is being cultivated within. This is not to say it must be so in all cases, but it certainly applies to those who invest nothing in their inner life and project all divinity outward, leaving nothing of the sacred within. Perhaps a return to the wisdom of Meister Eckhart would serve as a helpful correction. When religious projection is carried exclusively outward, it risks stripping the soul of its intrinsic value. Left empty, the soul becomes stagnant, unable to develop, and sinks into an unconscious state. This leads to the delusion that the origins of suffering lie entirely outside oneself, and the individual ceases to question how much of it may be self-created. The soul, in this diminished state, is seen as too insignificant to be capable of real good, or even real evil. Without a meaningful role in religious life, the soul is bypassed, and spiritual practice hardens into mere ritual and external conformity. Regardless of how one imagines the connection between God and the soul, one thing remains clear. The soul cannot simply be dismissed or reduced to a negligible factor. On the contrary, it possesses dignity as a conscious entity capable of relating to the divine. Even if that relationship is as small as a drop of water to the sea itself would not exist without countless drops. The doctrine of the soul's immortality lifts it beyond the impermanence of the mortal individual and bestows on it a touch of the eternal. For this reason, it is illogical, indeed unchristian, to treat the soul as something trivial. As the eye relates to the sun, so the soul corresponds to the divine. And because the conscious mind does not fully grasp the nature of the soul, it is absurd to speak of it with condescension or scorn. Even the devout believer cannot know the hidden workings of God, and must allow for the possibility that divine action may occur not only from outside but also from within, through the soul itself. Thus, there should be no discomfort in accepting the reality of divinely inspired dreams or illuminations arising from within that are not traceable to external causes. To deny that God could manifest within the soul would be a form of blasphemy. In fact, the closeness of the bond between the divine and the soul makes any devaluation of the latter impossible from the outset. The outward structure of Christian civilization reveals a troubling hollowness. Beneath the polished surface, the inner life remains untouched, unchanged. There is a disconnect between the soul and the external forms of belief. The inner person has not kept pace with the outward symbols and language of faith. All the elements of religion, imagery, scripture, ritual, exist in abundance outside. But within, the soul is governed by archaic forces, still sovereign in their original strength. The inner alignment with the divine archetype remains undeveloped due to a lack of psychological understanding, and in its place, a quiet heathenism persists. Though education and religious instruction have made great efforts, they have not sufficed. Too few have encountered the divine image as an intimate reality of the soul. The sacred remains an external encounter, never an inner experience. Thus, a deeper, darker paganism continues to reside within, sometimes openly, sometimes thinly concealed, and it threatens to overwhelm what is called Christian civilization. The approaches taken so far have failed to bring about the kind of inner transformation that would allow even the most basic principles of Christian ethics to guide the fundamental concerns of modern life. While missionaries may bring the gospel to distant lands, the spiritual wilderness within the modern Western world remains largely unreached. The people who inhabit it, though surrounded by Christian symbols, have yet to truly hear its message. If religion is to fulfill its profound educational task, it must begin again from the roots. As long as belief is confined to faith alone and remains an external structure, and the religious function is not awakened within the soul, nothing truly significant has taken place. What has not yet been grasped is that the great mystery is not only real but is, before all else, anchored in the depths of the human psyche. One who has not recognized this through personal experience may possess vast theological knowledge, but remains a stranger to the essence of religion, and even more so to its potential as a force of inner transformation. It is often the case that when one asserts the soul possesses an innate religious function, and that a central aim of adult education should be to bring the archetype of the God image, along with its emanations and effects, into consciousness, it is precisely the theologian who reacts with protest, accusing the perspective of psychologism. Yet, if experience did not consistently show that the highest values reside within the soul, independent of the presence of the antimum and pneuma also dwelling there, then psychology would hold no particular interest. The soul in that case would be no more than a pale wisp, but it is not. Repeated experience confirms that the soul is something vastly more substantial. It contains within it equivalents of all the symbols found in dogma, and more. This capacity makes the soul, an eye, fashioned to perceive light, a faculty that demands infinite scope and immeasurable depth. There are some who claim this view amounts to deifying the soul, but such elevation did not come from any human assertion. It is God who deified it. The religious function was not imposed upon the soul. Rather, its existence is demonstrated through observable facts. The soul is, by its very nature, religiosa. It expresses its religious function spontaneously, without needing external prompting, theory, or persuasion. A tragic misunderstanding persists among many theologians. They believe the challenge lies in proving the light exists, but the real issue is that the people are blind to their capacity for sight. It is senseless to preach about light to those who cannot see it. The need is not more sermons, but education in the art of seeing. Too many are incapable of linking sacred symbols to their own inner life. They cannot recognize that these divine images have dormant equivalents within their own unconscious. To awaken this inner sight, the path to the faculty of vision must first be cleared. How this can be done without engaging psychology, without a conscious encounter with the psyche, is beyond comprehension. Another significant misconception is the belief that psychology aims to introduce a new and possibly heretical doctrine. But if a blind man is slowly helped to see, no one should expect him to perceive truths instantly with perfect clarity. One must be grateful if he sees it all and begins to grasp what appears before him. The task of psychology is not to create new religious teachings, especially when the existing ones have yet to be inwardly realized or understood. In spiritual matters, nothing can be truly known unless it is personally experienced. Only through such inner experience does the connection between the psyche and the religious image emerge, like the bond between bride and bridegroom. Thus, when psychology refers to God as an archetype, it means God as a psychic type, an imprint within the psyche. The term type originates from typos, meaning a blow or imprint, which implies the existence of an imprinter. As a discipline focused on the soul, psychology must stay within the boundaries of its subject. It must avoid crossing into metaphysical claims or religious declarations. To postulate God even as a hypothetical cause would be to imply that God's existence can be scientifically demonstrated, which lies far beyond psychology's scope and violates its nature as an empirical science. Science must remain science. There are no such things as scientific professions of faith. Such combinations are contradictions in terms. The origins of the archetype are as mysterious as those of the psyche itself. Psychology's role, as an empirical discipline, is limited to determining, through comparative study, whether a particular imprint found in the psyche can reasonably be described as a God image. This does not imply a claim about the objective existence of God, any more than the presence of a hero archetype confirms that an actual hero exists. Jung observed that his psychological investigations revealed the presence of certain psychic types, and that these types correspond with well-known religious ideas. This, he argued, provides a potential pathway to the inner experiences that clearly and undeniably serve as the empirical basis for all religious life. According to Jung, those inclined toward religion are entirely free to accept whatever metaphysical interpretations they choose regarding the origins of these symbolic images, whether they call them God, Purusha, the Atman, or Tao, as the ultimate cause. Doing so, he said, offers a way to calm the profound unrest inherent in the human condition. But the intellect, he insisted, is not granted such freedom. It must adhere strictly to scientific principles and refrain from venturing beyond what can be known. The scientist, in Jung's view, is a careful and disciplined worker who cannot seize transcendence by force. If he were to indulge in such a move, he would, as Jung put it, be sawing off the very branch on which he sits. Jung maintained that the knowledge and direct experience of these inner images opens the way for both reason and emotion to engage meaningfully with the symbolic language offered by religious traditions. Far from undermining faith, psychology, in his view, does quite the opposite of what critics often claim. Rather than dismissing religious symbols, it offers new ways of approaching and understanding them. It helps people see the living meaning behind dogma. Psychology, Jung insisted, does not destroy but rather makes room, like opening up an abandoned house for new inhabitants. He drew on countless examples from his clinical experience. Individuals of all faiths, many of whom had abandoned or grown distant from their religion, found themselves rediscovering the essence of their former beliefs. This included not only Protestants and Catholics, among whom he noted more than a few striking cases, but even a Parsi who returned to the Zoroastrian fire temple. Such experiences, Jung believed, affirmed the objective nature of his position, and yet it was precisely this objectivity for which his psychology was most criticized. The charge was that it did not choose sides or take a definitive stance for or against any particular religious doctrine. But Jung challenged that criticism with a question. Might it not be the case that the refusal to declare one tradition superior, the deliberate act of withholding judgment and avoiding subjectivism, could itself be a meaningful decision? He asked whether it is so unthinkable to believe that God has spoken in many tongues, manifested in different forms, and that all these expressions might, in their own way, be true. He addressed the Christian objection that contradictory truths cannot both be valid. To this, he responded by pointing to the very heart of Christian doctrine. How can one be three? How can three be one? How can a mother remain a virgin? Religious belief is, by its very nature, built on paradoxes and apparent impossibilities. He cited Tertullian's famous affirmation, "The Son of God is dead," which is credible because it is absurd. And when buried, he rose again, which is certain because it is impossible. If Christianity asks its followers to believe such paradoxes, Jung questioned how it could criticize others for embracing a few more. To Jung, the paradox is not a flaw but a spiritual treasure, uniform meaning. In contrast, he saw as a sign of conceptual weakness. A religion, he warned, becomes impoverished when it loses its paradoxes or waters them down. But when paradoxes multiply, the faith is enriched, because only the paradox, he believed, can approach the fullness of life. Non-ambiguity and logical consistency, while useful in other domains, are too narrow to contain what is ultimately incomprehensible. Not everyone has the spiritual fortitude of someone like Tertullian. It is clear that he not only endured paradoxes, but found in them the deepest affirmation of religious truth. However, the overwhelming presence of spiritually frail individuals makes paradoxes potentially dangerous. When paradoxes are accepted passively, as part of inherited tradition, they pose no threat. But when an inadequately developed mind, typically the most self-assured, begins to focus its clumsy reasoning on the contradictory elements of a doctrine, treating them with all the seriousness it can muster, it often results in open mockery and contempt. Such a mind soon laughs scornfully at what it sees as obvious absurdity. Since the time when rationalism began to dominate, this descent has accelerated. Once the limited, overconfident intellect that cannot tolerate paradox is stirred into action, no amount of preaching can subdue it. At that point, a new challenge emerges, to gradually raise such a mind to a more advanced state, expanding the number of people capable of grasping, even faintly, the depth of paradoxical truth. Without this effort, the spiritual avenues into Christianity grow increasingly inaccessible. The paradoxes found in dogma lose all meaning, their irrationality becomes offensive, and as understanding becomes more superficial, these sacred ideas are dismissed entirely, seen as mere oddities from the past. The one who falls into this condition cannot comprehend the depth of what has been lost, having never encountered the sacred symbols as something inwardly personal, never having felt their connection to the structure of the psyche. And yet, it is precisely this essential insight that a knowledge of the unconscious can provide, offering the clarity of scientific objectivity. If such inquiry were constrained by dogma, it would never allow the individual's unconscious the freedom required for the genuine emergence of archetypal patterns. It is this very spontaneity, untouched by prejudice, that lends them their power. Any interference rooted in fixed belief stands in the way of authentic experience. If one holds to the belief in an all-powerful God and affirms the truth of religious doctrine, then why not trust that God also speaks through the soul? Why then this fear of psychological insight? Or does one, in contradiction to faith itself, secretly believe the soul is nothing but a dark abyss inhabited by demons? And even if that were true, it would remain no less persuasive, for the raw encounter with evil has, time and again, brought about as many spiritual awakenings as has the vision of good. The archetypes found in the unconscious can be empirically shown to correspond to the core structures of religious dogmas. In the interpretive language of the Church Fathers, there exists a vast reservoir of parallels with the spontaneous and individual expressions observed in psychology. What emerges from the unconscious is not a matter of subjective opinion or arbitrary invention. It simply is what it is, much like any other phenomenon in nature. Accordingly, these expressions arise naturally and are not shaped by doctrinal intent. They resemble the allegories of early Christian thought, which drew the whole of nature into their interpretive frameworks. Just as those writings offered remarkable allegorii Christi, the unconscious likewise gives rise to symbolic images of striking similarity. The essential difference lies in orientation. Patristic allegory directs itself toward Christ, while the psychic archetype remains itself, open to interpretation depending on the time, culture, and environment in which it appears. In the West, the archetype takes form in the image of Christ. In the East, It may be expressed as Purusha, Atman, Hiranyagarbha, the Buddha, or similar figures. The religious perspective, quite understandably, places emphasis on the divine source, the one who impresses the image, while scientific psychology focuses on the imprint itself, since that is all it can examine. From a theological point of view, the image reflects divine action. From a psychological perspective, it symbolizes something unknown, vast, and incomprehensible. Because the archetype is more fluid and varied than any single religious figure, psychology must describe it using a language not confined by culture, geography, or historical period. If, for instance, the archetype matched the image of Christ in every aspect and offered no elements beyond that figure, it would be correct to consider it a direct mirror of the Christian image, and name it accordingly. In such a case, the archetype and Christ would be identical. Yet experience shows that the unconscious, like the allegories of early theologians, produces many features not included in the fixed formulations of dogma. In other words, it generates non-Christian images as well, such as those already mentioned, which form part of the archetypal pattern. But these figures, too, fail to fully represent the undefined nature of the archetype. It is impossible for any single, definite image to embody the full indeterminacy of the archetype. For this reason, a psychological term has been introduced, the self. This term is specific enough to suggest the idea of human wholeness, yet open-ended enough to account for the mystery and indefinability of that totality. Its paradoxical character reflects the reality that wholeness consists of both the conscious and the unconscious dimensions of a person. Yet while the conscious part is knowable, the unconscious portion defies definition and resists clear boundaries. Thus, in scientific psychology, the term self does not refer exclusively to Christ or to the Buddha, but to the full range of symbolic figures that serve as equivalents. Each of these is a representation of the self. This way of speaking is necessary within a scientific framework and is not intended to express any theological or metaphysical bias. In fact, this objective stance allows one person to see the archetype in Christ, another in the Buddha, and so forth. Those who find such objectivity unsettling should consider that science depends entirely upon it. To deny psychology the freedom to maintain objectivity is to strike at the core of its validity. And should such a denial succeed, it would only deepen the already dangerous divide between secular understanding and the spiritual life upheld by the Church and religious tradition. It is entirely understandable that a science focuses primarily on its specific subject. Indeed, that is its fundamental purpose. Since the concept of the self occupies a central place in psychology, this discipline naturally approaches it from a perspective often opposite to that of theology. Psychology sees religious figures as representations pointing toward the self, while theology views the self as pointing toward its own central figure. In other words, theology might interpret the psychological self as an allegory of Christ. This contrast is certainly troubling, yet it is unavoidable unless psychology is denied its right to exist altogether. Therefore, tolerance is necessary. This stance is not difficult for psychology to maintain, as science does not make absolute or totalitarian claims. The Christ symbol holds immense significance for psychology because it is perhaps one of the most fully developed and differentiated symbols of the self, alongside the figure of the Buddha. This is evident in the broad and profound statements made about Christ, which correspond remarkably well with the psychological phenomenology of the self, though they do not encompass every aspect of this archetype. The self's vast and nearly limitless scope might seem a disadvantage when compared to the clear definiteness of a religious figure, but it is not the role of science to judge value. The self is not only indefinite, but also paradoxically possesses qualities of definiteness and uniqueness. This paradox may explain why religions founded on historical personalities, such as Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, have achieved worldwide prominence. The presence within a religion of a unique human figure, especially when combined with an indeterminate divine nature, aligns with the absolute individuality of the self, which unites uniqueness with eternity and the individual with the universal. The self exemplifies the union of opposites to the highest degree, which fundamentally distinguishes it from the Christ symbol. The androgyny of Christ represents the greatest concession made by the Church to the issue of opposites. The conflict between light and good on one side and darkness and evil on the other remains unresolved, since Christ embodies good while his counterpart, the devil, embodies evil. This unresolved opposition reflects a real-world problem that persists. By contrast, the self is profoundly paradoxical, encompassing thesis and antithesis as well as synthesis simultaneously. Psychological evidence supporting this is abundant, though too extensive to detail here. The symbolism of the mandala, for instance, offers insight into this truth. When the unconscious is explored deeply enough to bring the archetype into conscious experience, the individual faces the profound contradictions inherent in human nature. This confrontation opens the possibility of directly experiencing light and darkness, Christ and the devil. Such experiences, whether for better or worse, are only possibilities, never certainties, and cannot be induced by any human effort. They depend on factors beyond one's control and are unrelated to mere intellectual understanding or empathy. Rather, they resemble what might be called fate. One person's encounter with these opposites may lead them to embrace the truth of Christ, while another may find truth in the Buddha, excluding all other interpretations. Without the experience of opposites, there can be no true experience of wholeness, and consequently no genuine inner connection to sacred figures. For this reason, Christianity rightly emphasizes sinfulness and original sin, aiming to reveal the abyss of universal opposition within every individual, at least from an external perspective. However, this approach tends to fail when faced with even a moderately discerning intellect. Dogma then becomes something no longer believed and even regarded as absurd. Such an intellect remains one-sided, stuck at the level of mystery's ineptitude. It falls far short of the antinomies recognized by early theologians and is simply unable to endure the suffering such tension demands. There are known cases where the strict discipline and persistent focus on sinfulness, whether in certain Catholic practices or in a particular strain of Protestant education, have caused psychological harm that leads not to spiritual salvation but to visits to the psychiatrist. Though an understanding of the problem of opposites is essential, very few can bear it in lived experience, a fact not lost on the confessional system. As a response to this, the doctrine of moral probabilism has emerged as a kind of relief. Despite frequent criticism, this doctrine tries to soften the crushing weight of sin. Regardless of one's opinion of it, moral probabilism undeniably reflects a deep humanity and comprehension of human frailty, which helps ease the unbearable tensions of the world's contradictions. The profound paradox found in Christian thought, the insistence on original sin alongside the concessions of probabilism, is, from a psychological perspective, a necessary outcome of the Christian problem of opposites. Within the self, good and evil are not merely close but interwoven like inseparable twins. The undeniable reality of evil and its opposition to good split the opposites apart and lead inevitably to the crucifixion, the suspension and suffering of all life. Since the soul is by nature Christian, this outcome is unavoidable, as demonstrated in the life of Jesus himself. Every individual must be crucified with Christ, suspended in moral suffering akin to true crucifixion. In reality, however, this is only bearable to a limited extent, as such suffering is so overwhelming and hostile to life that an ordinary person can endure it only sporadically, if at all. How could anyone remain ordinary while bearing such agony? Therefore, a more or less probabilistic approach to the problem of evil becomes inevitable. The truth about the self, the inscrutable union of good and evil, emerges clearly in this paradox. Though sin is the gravest and most damaging condition, it is never so absolute that it cannot be addressed with probabilist reasoning. This is not necessarily a lax or frivolous stance, but a practical necessity for living. The confessional system functions much like life itself, struggling to avoid being overwhelmed by an irreconcilable contradiction. At the same time, the conflict persists fully, reflecting the antinomian nature of the self, which is itself both conflict and unity. Christianity has transformed the contradiction of good and evil into a universal dilemma and, by framing the conflict dogmatically, elevated it to an absolute principle. Within this unresolved tension, the Christian is cast as a champion of good, a participant in the cosmic drama. Truly following Christ involves a form of suffering that most people find unbearable. As a result, Christ's example is followed only partially or not at all, and the Church's pastoral practice often feels compelled to lighten the yoke of Christ. This entails a significant softening of the conflict's severity, leading in practice to a relativism between good and evil. Good becomes identified with the unconditional imitation of Christ, while evil is anything that obstructs this imitation. Human moral frailty and laziness mainly impede this imitation, and it is toward these weaknesses that probabilism offers practical leniency, which may at times resemble Christian tolerance, gentleness, and love more than the critics of probabilism allow. Though many fundamental Christian virtues are attributable to the probabilist approach, it cannot be ignored that this reduces much of the suffering inherent in following Christ, thereby lessening the harshness of the good-evil conflict to a manageable degree. This approach reflects a psychological archetype of the self, where even opposites appear united, although this differs from Christian symbolism, which keeps the conflict unresolved. According to Christianity, the world is split by a fundamental divide. Light opposes darkness, the higher opposes the lower. These forces are not united as they are in the psychological archetype. While religious doctrine condemns the idea of two becoming one, religious practice often permits the psychological symbol of the self's unity to serve as an approximate expression. Conversely, doctrine insists on the unity of three, while denying the unity of four. Since ancient times, both in the West and in China, odd numbers have been associated with masculinity and even numbers with femininity. The Trinity, therefore, represents a distinctly masculine deity, whereas the androgyny of Christ and the special veneration of the Mother of God do not equate fully with this concept. This insight leads to a central axiom of alchemy, expressed by Maria Prophetessa: one becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. The topic here concerns the psychological significance of alchemy, a subject that has largely escaped scientific inquiry until recently. While science has focused mainly on alchemy's role in the history of chemistry, it has paid little attention to its influence on philosophy and religion. Though alchemy's contribution to chemistry is clear, its cultural importance remains largely unrecognized and difficult to summarize briefly. In this context, alchemy can be seen as an undercurrent to the dominant Christian surface, much like dreams relate to consciousness. Just as dreams balance the conflicts of waking awareness, alchemy seeks to fill the gaps left by Christianity's tension of opposites. This is vividly illustrated by Maria Prophetessa's axiom, which resonates through centuries of alchemical tradition. Here, the even numbers representing the feminine principle, the earthly realm, and evil itself are inserted between the odd numbers of Christian dogma. These elements are personified by the serpens Mercurii, the self-creating and self-destroying dragon symbolizing the prima materia. This fundamental alchemical concept traces back to the primordial chaos, the matriarchal world depicted in ancient myths, such as the overthrow of a feminine world by a masculine order. The historical shift in consciousness towards masculinity is initially balanced by the unconscious's chthonic femininity. In some pre-Christian religions, the differentiation of the masculine took the form of a father-son relationship, a change crucial for Christianity. If the unconscious were merely complementary, this shift would have included a mother-daughter pair, as found in myths like Demeter and Persephone. Instead, alchemy shows the unconscious choosing a different pattern, the Sibyllatus type, represented by the prima materia and the cosmic sun, revealing that the unconscious is not complementary but compensatory. This means the unconscious does not simply oppose the conscious mind, but modifies it more like an opponent or partner. The sun archetype summons not a daughter as a complement from the depths, but another sun. This remarkable fact relates to the incarnation of a purely spiritual God in human nature, achieved through the Holy Spirit impregnating the Virgin Mary. Thus, the higher, spiritual, masculine principle leans toward the lower, earthly, feminine, and the primordial mother, who predates the world of the Father, adjusts herself to the masculine principle. With the help of the human spirit, alchemy, or the philosophy, she produces a son, not the opposite of Christ, but rather his chthonic counterpart, a mythical being conforming to the nature of the primordial mother. Just as the redemption of humanity, the microcosm, is the task of the upper sun, so the lower sun serves as a savior of the macrocosm. This, in essence, is the drama played out in the hidden depths of alchemy. It goes without saying that these two suns were never truly united, except perhaps within the mind and deepest experience of a few exceptionally gifted alchemists. Yet the purpose of this drama is fairly clear. In the Incarnation, it appeared as if the masculine principle of the father world was drawing near to the feminine principle of the mother world, prompting the latter to respond by approaching the father world in turn. Essentially, this represented an attempt to bridge the chasm separating the two realms as a form of compensation for the unresolved conflict between them. It may seem that this explanation resembles a Gnostic myth, but this is precisely the psychological domain in which gnosis finds its roots. The Christian symbol conveys a message of gnosis, and the compensation enacted by the unconscious is, in fact, an even deeper expression of gnosis. Myth is the primordial language natural to these psychic processes, far surpassing any intellectual formulation in richness and expressiveness. Such processes revolve around primordial images, which are best and most concisely conveyed through figurative language. The process described here exhibits all the hallmark traits of psychological compensation. The mask of the unconscious is not fixed. It reflects the attitude one projects toward it. Hostility lends it a menacing appearance, while friendliness softens its expression. This is not a mere optical reflection, but an autonomous response revealing the self-sufficiency of what answers. Thus, the Filius Philosophorum is not merely a distorted image of the Son of God. Rather, this son of Tiamat embodies the features of the primordial maternal figure. Though clearly hermaphroditic, he bears a masculine name, signifying that the chthonic underworld, rejected by the spirit and identified with evil, tends toward compromise. It is unmistakable that he represents a concession to the spiritual and masculine principle, despite carrying within himself the weight of the earth and the entire mythical essence of primordial animality. This response of the mother world demonstrates that the divide between it and the father world is not insurmountable, since the unconscious contains the seed of their unity. The conscious mind's essence is discrimination. To be aware, it must separate opposites, doing so against nature. In nature, opposites seek each other, and this is true in the unconscious, particularly in the archetype of unity, the self. Here, as in the deity, opposites neutralize one another. Yet when the unconscious begins to emerge, they separate, just as at creation. Every act of awakening consciousness is a creative act, and it is from this psychological experience that all cosmogonic symbols originate. Jung wrote that alchemy is fundamentally concerned with the seed of unity hidden within the chaos of Tiamat, which stands as the counterpart to divine unity. In Christian alchemy, this seed of unity takes on a trinitarian character, while in pagan alchemy it appears triadic. Other authorities suggest it corresponds to the unity of the four elements, thus forming a quaternity. The majority of modern psychological research supports the latter interpretation. In the few cases Jung observed where the number 3 appeared, it was linked to a systematic deficiency in consciousness, specifically an unconsciousness of the inferior function. The number 3, he argued, does not naturally express wholeness, since 4 is the minimum number of determinants required for complete judgment. Nonetheless, Jung stressed that alongside the clear tendencies of alchemy and of the unconscious toward quaternity, there is a recurring fluctuation between 3 and 4. This wavering appears repeatedly, even in the axiom of Maria Prophetessa, where the quaternity is masked and refined. Alchemy presents both 3 and 4 regimina, or procedures, and 3 as well as 4 colors. Although there are always four elements, often three are grouped together with a fourth placed in a special position, sometimes earth, sometimes fire. Mercurius, while Quadratus, also appears as a three-headed snake or a triunity. This duality reveals that the core ideas have both ternary and quaternary aspects. Jung pointed out a similar puzzle within the psychology of the unconscious. The least differentiated, or inferior, function is so deeply influenced by the collective unconscious that when it becomes conscious, it often brings with it archetypes such as the self, as Maria Prophetessa's words imply. 4 symbolizes the feminine, motherly, physical principle, while 3 stands for the masculine, fatherly, spiritual principle. Thus, the uncertainty between 3 and 4 reflects a tension between the spiritual and the physical, a vivid example of how every human truth is almost, but not quite, the ultimate truth. Jung began his introduction with the idea that human wholeness is the goal toward which the psychotherapeutic process ultimately leads. He acknowledged that this goal is tightly bound to one's philosophical or religious assumptions. Even when a patient believes themselves to be unprejudiced, the assumptions underlying their thoughts, lifestyle, morals, and language are inevitably shaped by history, often without their conscious awareness due to a lack of education or self-reflection. Therefore, analysis eventually clarifies the patient's broader spiritual background, far beyond personal determinants, bringing forth the very problems Jung had outlined. This phase of therapy is characterized by the emergence of symbols of unity, such as mandalas, appearing either in dreams or as concrete visual impressions. These mandalas frequently serve as the clearest compensation for the contradictions and conflicts present in the conscious situation. Jung noted that it would be inaccurate to blame the deep rift in the Christian worldview for this phenomenon, especially since Christian symbolism itself is deeply engaged with healing that very injury. Rather, the open conflict reflects the psychic state of Western man, highlighting his struggle to fully assimilate the breadth of Christian symbolism. As a physician, Jung recognized that he could not demand anything of his patients in this spiritual domain, nor did he possess the Church's means of grace. Faced with this reality, his task became clear. The archetypal images, corresponding in a way to dogmatic images, must be brought into consciousness. Yet he must leave it to the patient to decide how to integrate these, based on their assumptions, spiritual maturity, education, origins, and temperament, insofar as this could be done without causing serious conflict. For Jung, the physician's role was to help the patient cope with life, not to judge their ultimate spiritual decisions. He understood from experience that any form of coercion, whether suggestion, insinuation, or persuasion, becomes an obstacle to the most profound and decisive experience, being alone with one's own self, or whatever term one prefers for the psyche's objectivity. It is only in this solitude that the patient discovers what sustains them when they can no longer rely on external support. Such an experience alone can provide an indestructible foundation. Jung expressed that he would gladly leave this challenging task to theologians if it weren't for the fact that many of his patients come from precisely that background. These individuals ought to have remained connected to the community of the Church, yet instead they were cast off like dry leaves from the great tree, now clinging, often with a desperation born of fear, to the therapeutic process. Something within them holds on tightly, as if either they themselves or what they cling to would fall into an abyss the moment they loosen their grip. They are searching for solid ground on which to stand. Since no external support proves sufficient, they must ultimately find that foundation within themselves, a place that seems most unlikely from a purely rational perspective, yet entirely possible when seen through the lens of the unconscious. This is evident in the archetype of the lowly origin of the Redeemer. At first, the path toward this goal appears chaotic and endless, with only gradual signs emerging to indicate any real direction. The journey is not straightforward, but seems to circle around. Closer examination reveals it moves in spirals. Recurring dream motifs reappear at intervals, forming distinct shapes that define a center. In fact, the entire process revolves around a central point or arrangement, which sometimes even surfaces in initial dreams. As unconscious expressions, These dreams rotate around this center, drawing nearer as their symbolism becomes clearer and more detailed. Because of the variety of symbolic content, it can be difficult at first to recognize any order. Nor should it be assumed that dream sequences follow a fixed principle. Yet, the developmental process ultimately proves to be cyclical or spiral in nature. A useful analogy can be found in the spiraling growth patterns of plants. Indeed, plant imagery such as trees and flowers frequently appears in dreams and fantasies, and these symbols are often spontaneously drawn or painted. In alchemy, the tree represents Hermetic philosophy. One of Jung's studies explores a series of dreams filled with symbols of the center or goal. The evolution of these symbols closely parallels a healing process. The center or goal signifies salvation in its truest sense, a term justified by the abundance of religious references found within the dreams themselves. Jung regarded these processes as intimately connected with religion creating archetypes. Regardless of what religion might be in a broader sense, its empirically verifiable psychic components undoubtedly consist of such unconscious manifestations. Jung observed that too much time had been spent debating the fundamental question of whether faith-based assertions are true. Beyond the inherent impossibility of proving or disproving metaphysical claims, the very existence of these assertions is an undeniable fact requiring no further proof. When a widespread consensus aligns with these claims, their validity is thereby supported to that extent. What can be empirically examined is the psychological phenomenon itself, which belongs to a category entirely separate from objective truth or correctness. No phenomenon can be dismissed by rational critique, and in religious life, one must engage with phenomena and facts rather than hypothetical arguments. During the process of treatment, a dialectical dialogue naturally leads to an encounter between the patient and their shadow, the dark half of the psyche that is often rejected through projection. This projection manifests either by blaming others, whether those nearby or in a broader sense, for faults that clearly belong to oneself, or by transferring one's sins onto a divine intermediary through acts of contrition or the gentler form of attrition. It is well understood that without sin there is no repentance, and without repentance no redeeming grace. Likewise, without original sin, the redemption of the world could never have occurred. Yet there is a tendency to avoid questioning whether within this very power of evil God may have placed a deeper purpose, one of critical importance to uncover. This perspective often becomes compelling when dealing with individuals who confront their darkest shadows. The healer cannot simply gesture with moral certainty to the laws and command, "Thou shalt not." Instead, an objective examination and careful weighing of possibilities is necessary, informed less by religious doctrine and more by instinct and experience. There is a recognition of something akin to a felix culpa, a fortunate fall. It becomes clear that a person can miss not only happiness but also the essential burden of guilt, without which true wholeness remains unreachable. Wholeness is a kind of charisma that cannot be fabricated by skill or deceit. It can only be grown into, enduring whatever challenges its arrival brings. It is indeed a complication that humanity is not uniform but composed of individuals whose psychic structures span an immense range. Therefore, no absolute truth exists that offers salvation to all and damnation to none. Every universal claim falls into this difficult paradox. The concept of probabilism offers insight into the vast, complex task faced by religious institutions. Many initially recoil at probabilism, yet when confronted with the realities of life, their resistance softens or their scorn fades. Similarly, the healer must consider not whether something aligns with a religious institution, but whether it serves life and health. While moral codes may appear clear and precise on paper, when inscribed on the living tables of the heart, they often become fragmented, especially in the mouths of the most vocal advocates. It is commonly asserted that evil is simply evil and must be condemned without hesitation, yet evil remains the most challenging issue in an individual's life, demanding the deepest contemplation. Central to this is the crucial question: exactly who is the agent of the action? This question ultimately determines the value of the deed. Society tends to focus on what is done because it is immediately visible. However, over time, the right action carried out by the wrong person can be destructive. No perceptive person is fooled by the right deed performed by a wrong individual, nor by the wrong deed of a right individual. Therefore, the healer's attention must focus not merely on the deed, but on how it is performed, for this reveals the character of the doer. Both good and evil require thoughtful consideration, as they are idealized extensions and abstractions of action, forming part of life's chiaroscuro. Ultimately, there is no good that cannot lead to evil, nor evil that cannot give rise to good. Jung described how the encounter with the dark half of the personality, known as the shadow, inevitably arises during any reasonably thorough therapeutic process. He considered this issue as significant as the problem of sin within the Church. Such a confrontation is unavoidable and often painful. When asked how one should handle this, Jung explained that there is nothing to be done except to wait, with a certain trust in God, until, through a conflict borne patiently and with courage, a solution emerges that is uniquely destined for the individual, even if it cannot be predicted in advance. However, Jung was not suggesting passivity during this time. The therapist's role is to assist the patient in understanding all the material the unconscious brings forth amid the struggle. These unconscious products are not trivial. On the contrary, they rank among the most important phenomena Jung had ever encountered. Meanwhile, the patient is far from inactive. They must actively do what is right and exert every effort to prevent the power of evil from overwhelming them. For many, justification by works is necessary because justification by faith alone remains an empty phrase, often serving merely as a substitute for lacking experience. What is truly needed is real, tangible effort. Jung pointed out that Christ embraced the sinner rather than condemning them. Following Christ's example means embracing the sinner within oneself as well, because the command to do unto others as you would have them do unto you applies inwardly. Just as one would not accuse Christ of fraternizing with evil, one should not condemn oneself for loving the sinner within. This is not a pact with the devil. Love has the power to improve a person, while hate degrades, even when directed at oneself. The challenge here is similar to that in imitating Christ, yet the Pharisee within us resists associating with those deemed unworthy, such as publicans and sinners. Jung was careful to clarify that psychology did not invent Christianity, nor the concept of imitating Christ. Ideally, the Church could relieve everyone of the burden of their sins. But for those whom the Church cannot help, they must humble themselves greatly in imitating Christ by bearing their own cross. While the ancients could live by the wisdom of moderation, exaggerate nothing, all good lies in right measure, Jung lamented how far humanity still remains from such reason. Jung pointed out that beyond the moral challenges involved, there is another significant danger that can lead to complications, especially with individuals prone to pathological tendencies. This arises because the contents of the personal unconscious, namely, the shadow, are closely intertwined with the archetypal material of the collective unconscious. When the shadow becomes conscious, it often brings these archetypal elements along, which can exert an unsettling influence on the conscious mind. Activated archetypes can have a disturbing effect even on the most rational and cold-blooded thinker. Such individuals may feel overwhelmed by what they perceive as superstition intruding upon their reason. However, true superstition only appears in those who are pathological. Balanced individuals might fear losing their sanity, as anything the modern mind cannot rationalize tends to be labeled insane. It must be acknowledged that archetypal contents from the collective unconscious frequently take on grotesque and terrifying forms in dreams and fantasies. This means even the most skeptical and rational person is not immune to frightening nightmares and deep-seated fears. The psychological interpretation of these images cannot be ignored or dismissed. It naturally leads into the realm of religious phenomenology. The vast history of religion, encompassing mythology, folklore, and primitive psychology, serves as a rich repository of archetypal forms. Therapists can draw on this material to provide calming and clarifying contexts for a consciousness that feels overwhelmed and confused. Providing a meaningful framework for these strange and threatening images is essential to make them more understandable. Experience has shown that the most effective approach is to use comparative mythology as a tool. Jung noted that many examples demonstrate striking connections between individual dream symbolism and the symbolism found in medieval alchemy. This relationship is not unique to any one case, but is a general phenomenon that became clear to Jung only after many years of study of alchemical ideas and symbols. He also introduced the symbolism of alchemy in connection with Christianity and Gnosticism, focusing especially on the parallel between the alchemical lapis and Christ. While this introduction is necessarily brief and not a complete treatment of the complex subject, this parallel highlights important similarities between the goals of the alchemical opus and key Christian concepts. Understanding these connections is crucial for interpreting the images that appear in dreams and for evaluating their psychological impact. This insight has practical significance in psychotherapy, particularly because it is often the more intelligent and culturally sophisticated patients, those who cannot return to the church, who confront archetypal material directly. These encounters present challenges that are difficult for the therapist to manage without such knowledge. A mere understanding of the psychic structure of a neurosis is far from sufficient. Once the process reaches the realm of the collective unconscious, the material involved is healthy. That is, it represents the universal foundation underlying the individually unique psyche. Insight into these deeper layers of the psyche is aided not only by knowledge of primitive psychology and mythology, but even more so by familiarity with the history of modern consciousness and its immediate precursors. Modern consciousness is, on one hand, a product of the Church, and on the other, of science. The beginnings of science contain much that the Church was unable to accept, namely, remnants of the classical spirit and the classical appreciation for nature, which persisted and eventually found refuge in the natural philosophy of the Middle Ages. The old gods of the planets survived as the spiritus metallorum, and as astrological elements of destiny through many Christian centuries. While the Church's increasing focus on ritual and dogma distanced consciousness from its natural roots in the unconscious, alchemy and astrology tirelessly worked to preserve the bridge to nature, that is, to the unconscious psyche, against decay. Astrology repeatedly guided the conscious mind back to the understanding of hymarmene, the dependence of character and destiny on certain moments in time. Alchemy offered many hooks for projecting archetypes that could not be smoothly integrated into the Christian framework. Although alchemy always hovered on the edge of heresy, and the Church's decrees left little doubt about its disapproval, it was effectively shielded by the obscurity of its symbolism, which could be explained away as harmless allegory. For many alchemists, the allegorical dimension was so prominent that they firmly believed their work concerned only chemical substances. Yet there were always some for whom laboratory work was primarily about symbols and their psychic effects. These practitioners were aware of this to the extent that they condemned naive goldmakers as liars, frauds, and dupes. They asserted their position with statements such as "Aurum nostrum non est aurum vulgi," "Our gold is not the gold of the common people." While their work with chemical retorts was a genuine attempt to uncover the secrets of chemical transformation, it simultaneously, and often overwhelmingly, reflected a parallel psychic process. This psychic process was easily projected onto the unknown chemistry of matter, since it was itself an unconscious phenomenon of nature, akin to the mysterious transformation of substances. The symbolism found in alchemy thus expresses the entire problem of personality evolution described earlier, namely, the process of individuation. While the Church's central support is the imitation of Christ, the alchemist, often unknowingly and unintentionally, became vulnerable to the unconscious impulses and assumptions of his own mind due to the solitude and obscure nature of his work. Unlike Christians, who had clear and unmistakable models to guide them, the alchemist had only the symbolic writings of earlier authors. He believed he understood these symbols, but in truth, they merely stirred his unconscious. Wryly aware of this, alchemists coined the phrase obscurum per obscurius, explaining the obscure by the more obscure, a method that only deepened their immersion in the very process from which the Church sought to rescue them. Although the Church's dogmas contained analogies to the alchemical process, these analogies, in sharp contrast to alchemy, became separated from the natural world through their association with the historical figure of the Redeemer. The alchemical concepts, such as the four-in-one, the philosophical gold, the lapis angularis, and the aqua divina, transformed in the Church into the four-armed cross, symbolizing the sacrifice of the only begotten once in history and for all eternity. The alchemists, however, favored seeking knowledge rather than relying on faith. Despite this, as medieval men, they still considered themselves devout Christians. Paracelsus serves as a classic example of this stance. In reality, their position resembles that of the modern individual who prefers personal experience over adherence to traditional beliefs, or rather, finds it imposed upon them. Dogma is neither arbitrarily created nor a unique miracle, though it is often portrayed as miraculous to elevate it beyond its natural context. The core ideas of Christianity are rooted in Gnostic philosophy, which, in line with psychological principles, inevitably arose when classical religions had lost their relevance. This philosophy emerged from symbols produced by the unconscious process of individuation, a process that unfolds when collective structures dominating human life begin to decay. During such times, many individuals become possessed by numerous archetypes that force their way to the surface to form new dominant patterns. This possession nearly always manifests in the identification of individuals with the archetypal contents of their unconscious. Unaware that the roles imposed upon them are expressions of new, still unclear contents, these individuals embody them concretely in their lives, becoming prophets and reformers. To the extent that the archetypal content of the Christian drama resonated with the restless unconscious of the many, a consensus formed that elevated this drama to universally binding truth, not by conscious judgment, but through the irrational force of possession, which is far more powerful. Thus, Jesus became a protective figure or talisman against the archetypal powers that threatened to overwhelm everyone. The message proclaimed, "It has happened, but it will not happen to you as long as you believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Yet, it could and does happen to anyone in whom the Christian dominant has eroded. Consequently, there have always been those dissatisfied with the conscious dominance of life who, covertly and by indirect paths, whether to destruction or salvation, seek direct experience of eternal roots. Guided by the restless unconscious psyche, they find themselves in the wilderness where, like Jesus, they confront the son of darkness. An ancient alchemist, who was also a cleric, expressed this ordeal in prayer: "Purge the horrible darknesses of our mind, light a light for our senses." This statement reflects the experience of the nigredo, the first stage of the alchemical work, which was felt as melancholia, and corresponds psychologically to the encounter with a shadow. When modern psychotherapy encounters the activated archetypes of the collective unconscious, it is essentially a repetition of a phenomenon frequently observed during profound religious crises, though it can also appear in individuals for whom dominant ideas have lost their significance. A notable example is the descent into the underworld depicted in Faust, which, whether consciously or unconsciously, represents an alchemical work. The tension of opposites, as revealed by the shadow, plays a crucial, and indeed decisive, role in alchemy, since it ultimately leads to the union of opposites in the archetypal form known as the hieros gamos, or chemical wedding. In this union, the highest opposites, male and female, similar to the Chinese concepts of Yang and Yin, are fused into a unity purified from all opposition and thus rendered incorruptible. A necessary condition for this transformation is that the artisan does not identify with the figures involved in the work, but maintains them as objective, impersonal elements. While working in the laboratory, the alchemist was in a psychologically advantageous position because the archetypes were immediately projected onto chemical substances, preventing identification with them. However, this also posed a limitation. The alchemist had to represent the incorruptible substance as a chemical product, an impossible task that contributed to the decline of alchemy, which was eventually replaced in the laboratory by chemistry. Yet the psychic dimension of the work persisted, finding new interpreters, as evidenced by Faust, and the evident link between contemporary psychology of the unconscious and alchemical symbolism.